And that takes us to the second rule, which is you must frame your opponent. Okay, this is something that people on the right don't like to do, because by nature we're sort of nice, gentle, easygoing folk with families and lives, and this is not our first priority.
Yes, when I think of conservatives, especially Trump supporters, I think of nice, kind, gentle folks.
Oh yeah, and when I think of extreme left-wing, social justice, Black Lives Matter, Antifa people, I certainly think of nice, kind, gentle, easygoing folks. So today we're looking at a video from a progressive YouTuber who goes by TMM. In this video, TMM is criticizing a speech from Ben Shapiro about how to debate the left. That, however, will not be the main focus of my response. Believe it or not, I actually agree with most of the criticisms he makes against Ben's debate tactics. Instead, I'm going to be focusing my criticisms on arguments he makes in favor of things like taxation, welfare, and expanding the power of government. This should be interesting, so let's get right into it.
So rights are good, and they say education is a right. That means education is good. And you want to deprive these poor kids of education?
So I want to briefly expand upon the argument that Ben Shapiro is making here, because he is completely spot on about this. This is a very common strategy used by statists, especially on the left. They will label something a right in order to advocate for the government stealing money from people to provide something. And what that basically does is it forces anyone who disagrees with that into a sort of false dichotomy, where you either have to support the government stealing from people in order to provide stuff for free, or you have to agree that you don't believe in people's rights. What's fundamentally at issue here is a misconception of what a right actually is. Rights negate what others can do to you. They don't obligate others to act on your behalf. For example, your First Amendment right to free speech means that other people can't stop you from speaking. It doesn't mean anyone's obligated to give you a platform. Your Second Amendment right means that nobody else can come and take your gun away from you. It doesn't mean anybody's obligated to give you a gun.
Instead of arguing education is a right, you should ask a very basic question. Why is it okay for you to steal other people's money?
This, I think, is one of the fundamental moral differences between the left and conservatives. They believe, or at least they talk as though they believe, that nothing can ever justify taking money from someone who can easily afford to part with it. Confiscating money from millionaires and billionaires is, to them, worse than letting poor folks go without education. Some will say it's worse than even letting them go hungry.
So this is a very clear example of what I just discussed a moment ago. They paint the issue as a dichotomy and then force you to pick between two sides. If you don't want the government to be able to take other people's money against their will by force, then you don't care if people go without food or education or this or that. The problem here is that he's framing the issue as if these are the only two options. While it's perfectly conceivable that maybe there's a way we can provide education, food, shelter, things like that to people who may not necessarily be able to afford it without needing to forcibly take money from people. I don't know a single libertarian or even conservative who's against charity. Many people all across the country, all across the world even, volunteer their time, money, and effort to support others. So it is perfectly conceivable that there are other options besides just forcibly take money from people or let others starve.
Some conservatives even oppose the law that says the hospital can't turn you away if you can't show an ability to pay your bill.
There actually is a very good reason to oppose this law, and that's because it's basically slavery. If you're being forced to provide your labor to someone else against your will, how is that not slavery? I mean, we're told by the left that universal health care doesn't mean slavery, but here they are outright advocating for laws that force people to provide their labor to other people against their consent.
To them, wheeling a dying person's stretcher out the door of a hospital and leaving them to die is not as bad as forcing that hospital to provide services that the person may never be able to pay for.
So again, he's trying to paint a dichotomy where there isn't necessarily one. If hospitals aren't forced to treat people who can't afford treatment against their will, then that means poor people are just going to get wheeled out the front door on the stretcher and left to die. As if there aren't tons of charity organizations that provide health care to the poor. And I highly doubt it's the case that any hospital or doctor anywhere would just straight up refuse to treat someone who needs emergency treatment. They might say something like, okay, you can't necessarily afford the treatment now, but since you're in immediate need of emergency care, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and treat you now and we'll just work out a payment plan later. I have a hard time believing that a hospital would willingly just tell someone, fuck you, go die, because they can't afford to pay right then and there.
Now, I don't know if Ben would go that far, although given his views on healthcare, I wouldn't be surprised. But suffice it to say that he does think that letting someone go without education is worse than raising taxes on those who can most easily afford it.
Well, yeah, I mean, theft is theft. Using violence to threaten money from other people is immoral. The fact that you intend to use that money to provide something you consider to be good doesn't make it not theft.
I don't need to use ugly language to make that look bad. To me and many other people, that looks bad enough on its own.
So this guy seems to be arguing as if Ben Shapiro's argument is just so self-evidently bad, and as if he's not resorting to any dubious tactics to make his points. Like, okay, sure, maybe you're not intentionally using bad language here, but you definitely are framing the issue in a way that forces your opposition into a false dichotomy. Okay, yeah, sure, maybe Ben's arguments aren't exactly stellar here, but don't act like you're not also using any misleading tactics here.
What makes you morally superior that you get to steal other people's money?
So in order to justify forcibly taking other people's money, you do have to a certain extent believe that you're morally superior to everyone else. Because what you're basically saying is my subjective opinion on how other people's money should be spent usurps their right to enjoy the fruits of their own time and labor.
The fact that I'm taking it from those who can most easily afford it and spending it on educating people.
So his logic here is basically, I'm justified in forcibly taking other people's money because I'm taking it from people who have more than me and spending it on things that I subjectively believe are good. This is the basic logic behind socialism. As long as you have more money than me and I believe that what I'm spending that money on is justified, then I just have the right to take it from you. That's socialism in a nutshell. And the thing is, this logic can be used to justify almost any sort of theft. Because everybody wants to take money from people who have more than they do. And everybody believes that what they want to spend it on is justified. As a matter of fact, there's probably a lot of people out there with less money than TMM has, who probably have a lot of ideas of how they could spend his money better. Socialists get pretty excited about the systems they advocate for when they see it working out in their benefit. That tune changes pretty quickly, however, when they consider the possibility it could be turned against them.
Which benefits everyone.
So this is actually true. Society on the whole is more productive and overall better off when more people are educated. So now here's my question to you, TMM. If it really is the case that society as a whole would be better off if more people are educated, then why wouldn't people be willing to help pay for other people's education? Why do you need to go stealing the money then? Here's something to consider. Almost every company offers tuition assistance to their employees. Even teenagers earning minimum wage are eligible for some sort of education assistance at most companies. Now, why is it exactly that companies would spend so much money helping their employees get educated? Well, there are two reasons. The first reason is to get people to work there. Obviously, businesses want you working for them and not their competitors, which means they have an incentive to provide some perks on the job. And something like tuition assistance might be real appealing, especially to young people who often struggle with education expenses. The second and more important reason is that these companies benefit from a more skilled workforce. Educating their employees is a good long-term investment for most companies because it means that they'll have a greater pool of talent to draw from in their workforce. A lot of HR people will actually tell you it tends to be cheaper for a business to train a current employee to be a manager than to hire a manager from scratch.
Your useless major in ancient Greek economics is of no concern to me.
This is a disingenuous argument because I doubt Ben would approve of giving people free education even if it only went to medical and engineering students or to some other discipline that he sees as valuable.
I think you kind of missed the point that Ben was trying to make there. The point Ben was trying to make is why should people be forced to spend their money on things they disagree with or have no interest in? It may very well be the case that there's somebody out there who's willing to help you pay for your degree, especially if it's a company that's shorthanded on people with particular skills. But if Ben Shapiro, or anyone else for that matter, isn't interested in a particular subject matter, then why on earth should they be forced to pay for people to get degrees in that subject matter? And this logic doesn't just apply to college degrees. Should people who don't believe in abortion be forced to subsidize Planned Parenthood? Should people who oppose the war on drugs be forced to fund the DEA? This is one of the big reasons that taxation is immoral, because it forces people to pay for stuff that they may very well be against.
Pointing to degrees that people take primarily out of interest rather than practicality is a red herring. This is another logical fallacy Ben uses in his How to Debate book. The fact that not every degree has a clear benefit to society is not a relevant argument against subsidizing post-secondary education in general.
Actually, the fact that not every degree has a clear benefit to society is a very relevant part of the conversation here. Because if other people are forced to pick up the tab for your education, if you're not the one shouldering the risk of that financial burden, then obviously you're going to be less likely to choose a degree that will actually bring about any sort of productivity. When you're the one who's responsible for paying for your own education, when you're the one who has to shoulder that financial risk, then obviously you're going to have a much greater incentive to make sure that you're actually making a worthwhile investment, as opposed to if you could simply just offload all those expenses and risks onto the taxpayer.
When people say, the 1% will pay for it, the answer shouldn't be, well, the 1% won't be able to afford it, because that's assuming their morality. It's okay to take money from the 1%.
The reason why your rebuttal shouldn't be the 1% can't afford it is not because it assumes the morality of taking from the 1%.
Well, there are actually several different reasons why this could be considered a bad argument. But one of the biggest reasons that this argument fails is because it does in fact assume the morality of stealing from the 1%.
The reason this ought not be your rebuttal is because it's false.
It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Ben Shapiro wasn't making a claim as to whether it's true or false that the 1% can't afford to pay for all these expensive government programs. Rather, he was making the point that arguing in favor of forcing the wealthy to pay for expensive government programs on the basis that they can afford to do so presupposes that it's morally justified to forcibly take money from others as long as they can afford it. The fact that that argument makes that presupposition is true, whether or not it actually is the case that the wealthy can afford it or not.
There are countries with universities that don't charge tuition, and they fund them with progressive taxation. They don't seem to have any problem affording them.
So he makes this claim but doesn't really back it up. He offers basically no elaboration on this point. He doesn't cite any examples, he doesn't even link any sources in the description. We're basically just supposed to take his word for it that these countries are just able to hand out free university education to everybody and have no difficulty affording it whatsoever. The thing is, if you actually understand the reason why secondary education costs tend to be so high in the United States, you would understand why this claim can be called into doubt. College tuition expenses began to spike right around the same time the government started subsidizing student loans. And it's not a coincidence. When people pay for their own education out of their own pocket, then universities have an incentive to keep their costs reasonable, so that way students can afford to actually attend their schools. But as soon as the government comes along and opens up its big fat wallet, then those universities start seeing dollar signs, because they know that will increase the amount they can charge and get away with. And this effect isn't unique to education, by the way. Healthcare costs started to increase once Medicaid and Medicare were passed for pretty much the same reason.
The answer should be, what makes you think it is okay to steal money from people, period?
For a moment, let's set aside the issue of whether Ben is actually talking about theft.
He is talking about theft. You're advocating that people forcefully have their money taken away from them without their consent to pay for things that you want. What part of that isn't theft?
He is, by his own admission, framing the issue in the least charitable way he can, but let's run with it for a minute.
Even if it is true that Ben is framing this issue in the least charitable way that he can, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's wrong. A position can come from a biased point of view and still be 100% correct.
I don't think even Ben thinks that it's never okay to take anything from anybody ever.
This is actually true. Ben Shapiro is actually in favor of using taxation to pay for things like police and border patrol and things like that. That's because Ben, just like every other conservative, uses libertarian talking points without actually believing in libertarianism. And as a result of this, left-wing dipshits who don't know any better, such as yourself, end up lumping us together.
But he's talking like he thinks it doesn't matter if it's to save someone's life, and certainly doesn't matter if it is to facilitate a better educated population.
The reality is a bit more nuanced than he's making it out to be. Are there situations or circumstances where we could consider it justified to take someone else's property without their permission? Sure. For example, let's say that someone's being chased by someone who's trying to murder them, and they're not quite fast enough to be able to outrun them. Luckily, someone left their car unlocked with the keys in the ignition. I think most of us would agree that it would be justified for this person to steal that car to get away from the person who's trying to kill them. However, just because situations like this are conceivable doesn't mean that it's still not generally preferable to respect private property rights.
How would the world be better off, on the whole, if it operated under this principle?
I think that a world in which everyone is entitled to the fruits of their own labor is a lot preferable to a world in which someone else can demand the fruits of someone else's labor on the grounds that they believe they can spend it better.
Do you just get to rob people's houses? Is this your thing?
No, democratically administered taxation is not the same as just robbing people's houses.
So forcibly taking money from other people suddenly becomes not stealing when a majority of the population decides they're okay with it? Would you be in favor of laws prohibiting things like interracial or same-sex marriage if those laws were, quote, democratically administered? If you wouldn't, then obviously majority approval isn't the gold standard for determining morality.
This is not just an uncharitable framing of the issue, it is an outright dishonest framing framing of it.
How is this a dishonest framing? Getting robbed is exactly what taxation is. If you don't pay, the government sends men with guns to your house to kidnap you into a cage or kill you if you resist, in a way that would be considered completely illegitimate if anyone without a badge did it. The only people who are framing the issue dishonestly are the statists, who either obfuscate the fact that taxation is backed by violence, or try to argue as if government has some kind of special moral status.
Say, do you believe in climate change? Are you a climate denier? Like, no, I don't deny the climate. It exists. Right? Do you believe in climate change? Well, yes. I mean, the climate changes. What are you talking about? Would you like to get more specific?
So another Ben Shapiro tip is, pointlessly pretend to be an ignoramus. Ben knows what these questions about climate change are intended to discover.
Climate change is inherently a very complex issue. There's a lot of different factors at play, and there's a lot of different angles to the issue. For example, how exactly is it that the climate is changing? How quickly are these changes happening? What are the long-term effects of these changes going to be? To what extent are humans contributing to these changes, and what are some good mitigation factors? Climate change is a very complicated issue, and there's quite a bit of a tendency for people to overgeneralize or not explain specifically what their position is, which is why I don't really blame Ben for wanting to grill these people and figure out what exactly it is the position they're trying to argue.
Now, do you know, for example, what percentage of human activity is responsible for the rise in climate? Do you have any clue?
Why does that matter? Why ought we not be concerned with any degree of warming for which we are responsible? Even if drastic changes will only slightly decrease the probability of total civilizational collapse, don't you think they're worth considering?
So first of all, I want to address his claim that climate change will result in total civilizational collapse. Because again, like I discussed previously, climate change is kind of a very complicated issue. We don't fully understand what the long-term effects of climate change are going to be. Some of the effects might be negative, some of the effects might be positive. We're just not entirely sure yet. Oh, and by the way, human societies are very good at adapting to change. A lot of climate change fearmongers argue that if the ocean rises, then entire cities will be flooded and it will be mayhem and chaos everywhere. But as it turns out, a good portion of the human population already lives below the water table. If you look at places like Louisiana and the Netherlands, a majority of the land there is actually below the ocean level. And yet through various forms of innovation and engineering, they were able to make these places completely safe to live in. I highly doubt it would be the case that ocean levels will rise and people will just stand there scratching their asses wondering what to do.
What we would have to do in order to minimize human activity so as to go back to the amounts of carbon that were being sent into the atmosphere before the industrial age? Is that something that you're willing to? How many people are you willing to let die? How many people are you willing to impoverish?
Most global warming activists seem to want to prioritize cutting emissions from folks who can most easily do so. Focus on the least vulnerable populations, and that will minimize the total hardship produced by cutting emissions.
And how exactly do you decide who it is that counts as a vulnerable population? Who exactly is it that gets to make that call as to who's most easily able to cut emissions? This seems like a very complicated issue, and certainly not one that can be centrally planned. For example, let's say that you want the government to pass some sort of a law that bans rich people from flying their private jets, since, hey, they can most easily afford to cut back on their emissions, right? Well, what about all the people who help build and maintain those jets? What about the people who help refine the kerosene for it? You see, the economy is just too complex and interconnected to be able to pinpoint one specific group that can most easily carry a burden.
Ben seems to think that the only effective political solution to climate change is to turn the clock back to the 19th century technologically, but offers no evidence or argument that this is really the case.
Aren't you, in a way, kind of making the same fallacy here? You seem to be arguing as if immediate drastic changes are the only feasible solution to climate change, when I would argue that the solution to climate change has been around since the 60s. Nuclear power. It's reliable, commercially viable, has minimal impact on the environment, and produces no CO2. You would think that nuclear power would be a godsend to people who are concerned about climate change, but it's often climate alarmist leftists who are the most vocally opposed to nuclear power.